Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a look at the 4GB version of the Radeon RX 5500 XT to see how it performs, and I suppose more importantly, how it compares to not only the 8GB version, but also pre-existing products like the RX 580. The video will be split into two parts. Firstly, we'll check out all those blue bar graphs that you guys enjoy, and then we'll wrap things up with a pretty lengthy discussion about VRAM capacity. But before any of that, today's video is sponsored by Gigabyte and their special end-of-year offer for Australian and New Zealand customers. Right now, if you buy any Gigabyte X570 motherboard with a Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9 CPU, you'll be eligible for a free Gigabyte Gen 4 500GB SSD valued at $250. Alternatively, if you purchase a Gigabyte Radeon RX 5700 XT graphics card, you'll receive a bonus Gigabyte M.2 NVMe 512GB SSD, valued at $120. So, for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so on hand for testing, we have the Sapphire Pulse RX 5500 XT 4G, which comes in this cute little box. And then for comparison, we have the Sapphire Pulse RX 5500 XT 8G, which comes in this equally cute box. The great thing about using these cards for this 4GB versus 8GB test is that with the exception of the memory capacity, they're identical, physically and in terms of specifications. So there are no other factors such as the cooler quality or operating clock speeds that can influence the results. The Sapphire Pulse 5500 XTs are also excellent quality models that retail for just $10 over the MSRP, which is very reasonable given they feature a factory overclock, well-designed cooler with an excellent aluminium backplate, and they even come with a dual BIOS. They're also relatively compact dual slot cards that measure just 233mm long. The test system used includes a Core i9 9900K clocked at 5GHz with 16GB of DDR4 3400 memory, and the exact graphics cards models used for testing can be found in the video description. Once again, we have 12 games to look at, and all have been tested at 1080p and 1440p using medium to high quality presets or settings. So let's get into the results. First up, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here the 4GB 5500 XT was 10% slower than the 4GB version when looking at the average frame rate, and that meant it was no faster than the RX 580 and 6% slower than the RX 590. It was also on par with the GTX 1650 Super, averaging just 2 FPS more for a mere 3% performance increase. Now, increasing the resolution to 1440p doesn't change too much. The 4GB version was 11% slower this time, and again, that placed it on par with the RX 580 and slightly ahead of the GTX 1650 Super. The performance drop-off for the 4GB version in Assassin's Creed Odyssey at 1080p is pretty minimal. That said, performance-wise, it was also only comparable to the GTX 1650 Super. Interestingly, the move to 1440p does see quite a significant reduction in performance for the 4GB 5500 XT, and that's interesting because the 1650 Super doesn't appear to suffer nearly as much. As a result, the 4GB 5500 XT was 12% slower than the 1650 Super. Basically, under those conditions, you're looking at RX 570 performance. I think I'm going to have to update the Red Dead Redemption 2 testing soon for these lower end GPUs with something like the medium or low quality settings, because high is just, well, it's too high for these GPUs. At 1080p, the 4GB 5500 XT does see a 9% performance hit, which isn't great, and that also makes it 9% slower than the 1650 Super. Although the 4GB 5500 XT also takes a hit at 1440p, I think the biggest performance bottleneck here are the GPUs themselves. So in other words, the GPUs themselves are choked before the VRAM capacity becomes a serious issue. Moving on to World of Tanks, this game only allocates around 3GB of VRAM at 1440p using the maximum in-game quality settings with the HD client version. So unsurprisingly, at 1080p we see no difference between the 4GB and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT. It's also the same story at 1440p, again up to just 3GB of memory is allocated here, so both the 4GB and 8GB versions deliver the exact same level of performance. The 4GB 5500 XT drops a few frames when compared to the 8GB model in Far Cry New Dawn, but overall performance at 1080p using the second highest quality preset is still very good. Much the same as seen at 1440p, again we're using the second highest quality preset, and yet despite that the 4GB 5500 XT was still able to average just over 60 FPS. Now, we're not playing Rainbow Six Siege with the highest possible quality settings, rather the second highest quality preset has been enabled with a manual render scale of 100%. This saw the 4 and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT deliver the same 128 FPS on average at 1080p. Even at 1440p we see the same average frame rate, however it's the 1% low performance that falls away with the 4GB model, and while still very playable, this cut down version wasn't quite as smooth overall. Next up we have Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, and at 1080p using the high quality preset, which is one step below the Max Ultra type setting, we see no difference in performance between the 4GB and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT. Even at 1440p, performance was much the same, and this meant the 5500 XT delivered basically the same level of performance you'll see from the 1650 Super and even the 3GB GTX 1060. Moving on to Battlefield 5, and here the 4GB 5500 XT was able to keep pace with the 8GB version, both rendering 83 FPS on average, which is essentially the same level of performance you'll receive from an RX 580. The story though changes quite a bit at 1440p. Here the 4GB 5500 XT struggles to keep up, and we see the average frame rate drop by 11%. This meant the 5500 XT was now only able to match the 1650 Super and RX 570. Here we see that Call of Duty Modern Warfare is very memory hungry, even at 1080p, though we are using the highest possible quality settings. The 4GB 5500 XT still averaged an impressive 96 FPS, but even so that meant it was 15% slower than the 8GB version, as well as Nvidia's GTX 1650 Super. The drop-off at 1440p was just as harsh. Here the 4GB version was 17% slower, and again the 4GB 1650 Super didn't appear to suffer the same fate, which is quite interesting. Again, with the 4GB 5500 XT, you're looking at RX 570-like performance. Here we see when testing with Metro Exodus using the ultra quality settings that the 4GB 5500 XT hangs in there rather well, basically matching the 8GB version as well as the 8GB RX 580. And we see much the same at 1440p. This time the 4GB 5500 XT was miles faster than the GTX 1650 Super, producing around 20% more frames on average. F1 2019 isn't that memory sensitive, and as a result the 4 and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT enable the same level of performance at 1080p. And it's also the same situation at 1440p. Here the 4GB 5500 XT was good for 86 FPS on average, the same performance you'll receive from the RX 580. And last up we have Gears 5, and here we see no performance difference between the 4 and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT at 1080p. It's the same story at 1440p, here both models spat out 48 FPS on average, which is basically the same level of performance delivered by the RX 580 and GTX 1650 Super. We've now looked at a dozen games, tested at 1080p and 1440p, so now it's time to break all that data down and make sense of it. So let's start by looking at the average performance of all 12 titles. These graphs certainly don't tell the whole picture, but we'll quickly take a look at them and then we'll get into a more detailed breakdown. Okay, so looking at the results like this can be quite misleading as it doesn't really show when and how you can run into trouble with the more limited 4GB VRAM buffer. But overall, when taking all the games into account, the 4GB 5500 XT was only 3.5% slower than the 8GB version, and that placed it on par with the RX 580 and GTX 1650 Super. We also see a similar story at 1440p. This time the 4GB 5500 XT was 5% slower on average when compared to the 8GB model, and again basically matched the RX 580 and GTX 1650 Super. Taking the averages from the 1080p data, we see that the 4GB 5500 XT is only able to match the cost per frame ratio of the RX 580, so you're trading half the VRAM for a more efficient product, and I'll talk more about this in a moment. For now, the real takeaway here is the fact that the GeForce GTX 1650 Super comes in 5% cheaper per frame, as it costs $10 US less, which at these price points can be a serious consideration for some gamers. However, things can look much worse for the RX 5500 XT if we look at a single game like Battlefield 5. I'm using the 1440p data here because it represents a situation where the 4GB VRAM capacity starts to really impact performance, something you'll no doubt see more of over the next few years. So where the difference between 4 and 8GB of memory can be seen, the Radeon RX 580 is miles better in terms of value, and the RX 570 is just in another class. delivering the same performance as the 4GB 5500 XT at a massive 24% discount per frame. This is probably the most telling graph we've looked at so far when evaluating the value of the 4GB 5500 XT. Wrapping things up, we have a few RX 5500 XT 4GB versus 8GB graphs that show the margins on a per game basis. Here you can see that the 4GB model really struggled in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Red Dead Redemption 2, while we saw small performance drop-offs in Far Cry New Dawn, Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Metro Exodus, though admittedly they were so small in those titles that it's really not worth talking about. Now here, if we look at the 1% low performance, we see similar margins for the most part, though the 4GB model struggled a little more in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, at 1440p, we see no difference between the 4 and 8GB models for half of the games tested, at least when comparing the average frame rate performance. The performance drop in Call of Duty was again big, and this time we also see a big drop off in Assassin's Creed Odyssey and double-digit performance losses in Battlefield 5 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. But this is the most telling graph for future performance, the 1440p 1% low data. Again, we see little to no impact for half of the games tested, but the other half see double-digit hits to the frame rate and 3 titles dropped by more than 15%. Okay, so that's how the 4GB version of the Radeon RX 5500 XT stacks up, and like the 8GB version, in a word, it's disappointing. And the situation really is disappointing. AMD arrived late with their budget Navi offerings, and due to what I believe is a 7nm supply issue, they're just not in a position where they can sell them in significant enough quantities to justify being competitive on price. As it stands right now, the GeForce GTX 1650 Super is, in my opinion, a more compelling buy when compared to the 4GB 5500 XT. Overall, you are looking at basically the same level of performance, just a very small discount with the Nvidia part. Also, in our small sample of games, the 1650 Super's performance seemed a little more consistent. It didn't suffer the big performance hits in titles such as Battlefield 5 and Call of Duty Modern Warfare, for example, due to that more limited 4GB memory buffer. So, if you're after an efficient low-end graphics card, the GTX 1650 Super looks like the way to go. However, in a recent poll I asked, what do gamers prefer? More efficiency or VRAM capacity, and as I suspected, an overwhelming number of you picked memory capacity as your preference. That being the case, for the majority of you spending less than $200 US on your graphics card, you won't be interested in the 4GB 5500 XT at $170 or the 4GB GTX 1650 Super at $160, not when you can purchase an 8GB RX 580 for $170, sometimes as low as $150. And yeah, it does use substantially more power, but who cares? I wouldn't, and it certainly seems like that's the case for most of you watching this video. It is also worth noting that the idle power consumption is much the same, so while the card has the potential to run a little hotter and generate a little bit more noise when gaming, having the extra headroom with the extra memory capacity seems more important for most of you. And what that means is, while it's still possible to purchase the 2.5-year-old discounted RX 580 8GB graphics card for the same amount of money as these newer 4GB models, that's what you should do. Had AMD priced the 8GB 5500 XT at no more than $170 and the 4GB model at $140, then I feel they'd be viable options. But that just doesn't seem possible given the current supply constraints. Now, before wrapping this video up, let's talk a little more about the 4GB versus 8GB memory buffer thing, because there seems to be a lot of debate around this topic. I see many people claiming that 4GB just isn't enough and graphics cards shouldn't be selling with such a limited memory capacity in 2019, while others claim 8GB is still overkill for 1080p gaming. In my opinion, neither claim is necessarily right or wrong. It just depends, mostly on what you plan on playing and how you plan on playing it. Now, I should just make it clear that I do agree that $200 for a tiny GPU with a 128-bit wide memory bus in late 2019 is too much, regardless of the memory capacity. So I'm certainly not attempting to justify the RX 5500 XT or the GTX 1650 Super's pricing. I'm just saying how much VRAM you require depends. For example, if you're a competitive gamer, like myself, who typically doesn't care about the immersive single-player experience with amazing graphics, then VRAM capacity doesn't really matter. For example, when I play Battlefield 5, textures and most other quality settings aren't cranked up to ultra. Instead, almost all of them are set to low, which sees VRAM usage drop from around 5GB at 1440p down to around 2.5 to 3 gigabytes, and frankly, the game still looks really good. It's the same for other games I play, such as Fortnite, Apex Legends, and StarCraft 2. All of those are played mostly with low quality settings. It just makes it easier to spot enemies, and it removes a lot of distracting effects. And I'm not alone here. This is how most gamers play competitive titles, even those that aren't all that demanding to begin with. So for someone wanting to play Fortnite, for example, spending more money to secure a card with more VRAM is really just a waste of money. However, if you're more like Tim, who's not as big into competitive multiplayer games and prefers to play titles such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Shadow of the Tomb Raider for their stunning visuals and storytelling, then ensuring that you have a graphics card with headroom in the VRAM department is more important and probably worth paying a small premium. So if you are this sort of gamer, then you will want to avoid 4GB models like the plague, especially given the upcoming Xbox Series X, which will have 16GB of GDDR6 memory with 13GB accessible to games. So expect the next generation of games to see a big step up in memory usage. All that said, I'd just like to note that not having enough VRAM isn't the disaster that I see so many gamers making it out to be. It's nothing like, for example, having a dual-core processor and playing a game that requires a quad-core or better. In that scenario, you're pretty well screwed, and no matter how low you drop the quality settings, you're going to have a bad time. With limited VRAM, generally all you have to do is drop down something like the texture quality setting, and you're away. Sure, the game might not look as good, but it's still going to be playable, and in a make-do scenario, that's really all you can hope for. Also, how the game handles insufficient VRAM will depend on the game. Some turn into a slideshow until you reduce memory usage, others won't even let you use the higher quality settings like what we see with Red Dead Redemption 2, and some will automatically reduce or remove textures entirely, often leaving you with a bit of a blurry mess. In the end, I feel providing more affordable options with less memory for casual or competitive gamers isn't a bad thing. You just don't want to be paying near $200 for a cut-down option in late 2019. As I said, had the 4GB 5500 XT come in at $140 US, then it would have been a pretty solid deal. But as it stands, you're just better off with an 8GB RX 580. End of story. And with that, I'm going to end the video here. If you enjoyed it, like, share, subscribe, do the YouTube stuff. And if you want to become more involved with the channel, get access to some pretty cool perks, then yeah, head over to the Harbor Unboxed Patreon page because you can get access to our monthly live stream, exclusive Discord chat, a few other cool things. Also, we have merch, some pretty cool hoodies and other things. So yeah, check out our merch store if you're interested in that. But above all else, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.